Yay, third grade. We're back in my living room. I am going to start James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl, the same author who wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I do appreciate everybody who did vote between Charlotte and James, but I'm kind of glad James won because we will be doing Charlotte's Web together and I can't wait to do that one in person. So we're gonna start James and the Giant Peach. I tried to upload a video yesterday before I went to bed and it didn't work the way I wanted it to. And I was wearing a panda onesie. You guys know the one. It's the one that I wore to school that you made fun of me for, but that you loved because, don't lie, the tail is awesome. But I feel like this is probably better. Maybe I'll do a onesie video next time. The unicorn one? Let me know. Message me. Tell me what onesie that you want. Not the Christmas tree. Okay, no. I'm not going to do the one with the tutu, but maybe the flamingo? You guys know which ones I have. Let me know which ones you want. Chapter 1. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had a happy life. He lived peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was the sandy beach for him to run about on, and the ocean to paddle in. It was the perfect life for a small boy. Then, one day, James's mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there was a terrible happening. Both of them suddenly got eaten up, in full daylight, mind you, on a crowded street, by an enormous, angry rhinoceros who had escaped from the London Zoo. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents, but in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. And I am sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as, "You disgusting little beast," or "You filthy nuisance," or "You miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a queer ramshackle house on the top of a high hill in southern England. It was a hill so high that almost anywhere in the garden James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny gray dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or a picnic. And he currently wasn't permitted to go alone. "The nasty little beast will only get into mischief once he goes out of the garden," Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishments were promised him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. Now here's one of the illustrations of the house way up on the hill, where he could see for miles around. And on the next page, there's a picture of little James looking in what looks to be like the garden. See that broken fence? The garden, which covered the whole of the top of the hill, was large and desolate. The only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old laurel bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sand pit, and no other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or cat around to keep him company, and as time went on, he became sadder and sadder and more lonely, and he used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that were spread out below him like a magic carpet. Chapter 2. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I say was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar, and then a very peculiar thing on its own caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for a kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for one moment. Let's stop here. So it said in the beginning that James had had a happy life up until he was 4, for the first 4 years of his life, and then it said 3 years went by. Even though we aren't sure about what time frame it was, James is either 7 or 8 in this story. And so I want you to kind of think about, when we talk about James, how you would feel being the fact that you're 8 and 9 years old, how you would feel going through these things that James had to go through. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy eyes, a sunken mouth, and one of those white flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was a great white soggy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice, a long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these 2 ghastly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and then screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Let's take a look at what they look like. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, look at that. 2 very, very, very opposite women, but it seems as though that they are both horrible people. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror on her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. "I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face. Observe my shapely nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks. And if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget," Aunt Spiker cried, "how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks. And please ignore the pimple on my chin." "My dear old trout," Aunt Sponge cried out, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'd capture all the nation's hearts, and they'd give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign." "I think you'd make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in their gardens. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking a bunch of wildflowers. And all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," James cried out, "and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please just for once go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him," cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will," Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel as hot," she said. "And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and leave me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind that clump of old, dirty laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on. And he covered his face with his hands, and he began to cry and cry. And here he is leaning on that chopping block, crying and thinking about all of the stuff that he's missing and all the fun that he used to have and all of those friends that he had down by the seaside. It doesn't seem like he's in a very good position right now. Let's see, should we keep going? Chapter 3? I think we can keep going. It was at this point that the first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that led to so many other much more peculiar things, happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned around and saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on his stick, staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and creaky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he said, beckoning James with his finger. "Come right up close to me, and I will show you something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. I would be too frightened to move. Some old man wants you to come up to him, and he's telling you to come here with a creaky old finger and a squeaky voice? No thanks. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put his hand in his pocket and took out a small white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James's face. "You know what's in this, my dear? You know what's inside this little bag?" Then he came nearer still, leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James that James could feel breath blowing in his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mildewed, like the air of an old cellar. A cellar, boys and girls, that's like a basement. They used to have those in really old houses where you could kind of enter from the outside. You like lift up a thing, you could walk down into the cellar, but it's kind of like what we would call a basement. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag and tilting it towards James. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals, each one about the size of a grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them," the old man whispered. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming up from inside it, and then he noticed that all the thousands of little green things were slowly, very, very slowly, stirring about and moving over each other as though they were alive. there's more power and magic in those things than all the rest of the world put together, the old man said softly. But what are they? James murmured, finding his voice at last. Where did they come from? Aha, the old man whispered. You'd never guess that. He was crouching a little now, pushing his face still closer and closer to James, until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin on James's forehead. There's that creepy little old man with the big, huge forehead. Then, suddenly, he jumped back and began waving his stick madly at the air. Crocodile tongues, he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights with the eyeballs of a lizard. Finger of a young monkey, and the gizzard of a pig, and the beak of a green parrot, and the juice of a porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week. Then let the moon do the rest. All at once, he pushed the white paper bag into James's hand and said, Here, take it. It's yours. Chapter 4. James Henry Trotter stood there clutching the bag and staring at the old man. And now, the old man said, all you've got to do is this. Take a large jug of water, pour in all the little green things, then very slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your own head. That sets them off. It gets them going. In a couple of minutes, the water will begin to froth and bubble furiously, and as soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole jugful in one gulp. And then, my dear, you will feel it churning and boiling in your stomach, and steam will start coming out of your mouth, and immediately after that, marvelous things will start to happen. Fabulous, unbelievable things, and you will never be miserable again in your life, because you are miserable, aren't you? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now, off you go and do exactly as I say. And don't whisper a word of this to those 2 horrible aunts of yours. Not a word. And don't let those green things in there get away from you either. Because if they do escape, then they will be working their magic upon somebody else instead of upon you. And that isn't what you want at all, is it, my dear? Whoever they meet first, be it bug, insect, animal, or tree, that will be the one who gets the full power of their magic. So, hold the bag tight, don't tear up the paper. Off you go, hurry up, don't wait. Now is the time, hurry. And with that, the old man turned away and disappeared into the bushes. So far, so good. Already it's really exciting, so I can't wait to see what happens in chapter 5. Hopefully you can't wait either. We'll see you tomorrow. Mwah. Stay safe, guys.